The empath is often praised as gifted, intuitive, deeply caring. But what we rarely ask is why this sensitivity had to develop in the first place. Because empathy, when it becomes compulsive, is not a personality trait. It is a survival strategy. The empath is usually the child who learned very early that their own needs were dangerous, inconvenient, or invisible. Love did not come freely. It had to be earned. So the child became watchful. They studied tone, mood, silence. They learned how to feel the room before they felt themselves. Not because they were naturally selfless, but because their safety depended on it. Empathy is often treated as an inherent trait, something noble and innate, a sign of emotional intelligence or moral depth. But for many people, empathy was not discovered, it was constructed. It emerged not from safety, but from necessity. Long before it became a strength, it was a strategy. In environments where emotional unpredictability ruled, paying close attention to others was not optional. It was how connection was maintained, how conflict was avoided, how love was preserved. When a child grows up around adults who are overwhelmed, volatile, distant, or emotionally unavailable, the child adapts by becoming attuned to subtle cues. A shift in tone, a pause in speech, a change in energy becomes meaningful. The child learns to anticipate rather than express, to sense rather than assert. This heightened awareness is not about generosity, it is about survival. The nervous system learns that safety lies in vigilance. Over time, this survival skill becomes mistaken for identity. The person begins to believe they are naturally empathetic, naturally self-sacrificing, naturally attuned to others. But what is often overlooked is the cost. Attention that should have been directed inward was rerouted outward. Emotional energy was spent managing relationships rather than understanding oneself. Needs were postponed, sometimes indefinitely, because attending to them once threatened belonging. This form of empathy is exhausting because it is driven by fear, not freedom. It is not a choice but a compulsion. The body remains on alert, constantly scanning for emotional shifts, interpreting silence as danger and disapproval as catastrophe. Even in adulthood, long after the original threat has passed, the system behaves as if connection must still be earned. Recognizing empathy as a survival response changes the conversation. It invites compassion for the adaptation without romanticizing the wound. It allows space to question whether constant self-giving is truly aligned or simply familiar. And it opens the possibility that empathy can evolve from a reflex rooted in fear into a conscious expression rooted in presence, safety, and genuine connection. Selflessness is often celebrated as a virtue, a sign of moral maturity and emotional depth. But beneath many acts of selflessness lies a quieter, more painful reality: self-abandonment. This pattern begins early, when a child learns that expressing needs, emotions, or preferences disrupts the fragile balance of their environment. In order to preserve connection, the child adapts by disappearing emotionally. What looks like kindness is, at its core, a protective withdrawal from the self. In households where love is conditional, inconsistent, or dependent on performance, the child learns a crucial lesson: being oneself is risky. Anger may be met with rejection, sadness with dismissal, desire with guilt. So the child becomes agreeable, helpful, undemanding. They learn to read what others want and offer it before being asked. Over time, this adaptation is praised: mature, easy, thoughtful, reinforcing the belief that self-erasure is not only necessary but admirable. As an adult, this person often continues to give without limits, confusing worth with usefulness. They may feel uncomfortable receiving care, minimizing their own pain while amplifying the struggles of others. Their sense of identity becomes anchored in service, leaving little room for personal truth. The inner voice that once tried to speak learned to stay quiet, replaced by a constant orientation toward others' comfort. This is not generosity born from abundance. It is generosity driven by fear, the fear that asserting oneself will lead to abandonment, conflict, or loss of love. The body carries this memory, responding with anxiety or guilt whenever boundaries are approached. Saying no feels dangerous. Rest feels undeserved. Desire feels selfish. True healing requires recognizing that selflessness rooted in self-abandonment is not love but loss. Reclaiming the self means listening again to suppressed needs, honoring emotions without justification, and understanding that authenticity is not a threat to connection. When care for others no longer requires the disappearance of the self, giving becomes a choice rather than a compulsion, and compassion flows from wholeness rather than sacrifice. What is often labeled as deep compassion is In many cases, a nervous system locked in vigilance. Hypervigilance is not an emotional virtue, it is a physiological state shaped by early uncertainty. When safety was inconsistent, attention became sharpened not by curiosity but by fear. The body learned that staying alert to others' moods was essential for survival, and this alertness was later mistaken for care. A child in an emotionally unstable environment does not have the luxury of innocence. They monitor tone, facial expressions, silence, and shifts in energy because these signals once predicted danger or rejection. This constant scanning is not empathy in its true form. It is anticipation. It is the effort to prevent harm before it arrives. Compassion arises from presence, hypervigilance arises from threat. In adulthood, this pattern persists even when the original conditions are no longer present. The person may feel responsible for regulating the emotions of others, stepping in before conflict surfaces, absorbing discomfort that does not belong to them. They may pride themselves on being intuitive, yet feel chronically exhausted, anxious, or disconnected from their own inner world. Their attention is always outward, rarely resting long enough to register their own feelings. The difference between compassion and hypervigilance lies in choice. Compassion allows space, it listens without losing oneself. Hypervigilance offers no rest. It is driven by an unconscious belief that if one stops paying attention, something bad will happen. The body stays tense, the breath shallow, the mind alert even in moments that should feel safe. Because hypervigilance was once protective, it is often defended. Letting go feels dangerous, like abandoning a shield. Yet true connection does not require constant monitoring. It requires safety within the self. Healing involves teaching the nervous system that presence does not depend on control, and care does not require self-sacrifice. When vigilance softens, compassion can finally emerge as a genuine response rather than a reflex born of fear. For many people, the idea of setting boundaries does not feel empowering. It feels like an act of betrayal. This reaction does not come from weakness or lack of clarity, but from memory stored in the body. There was a time when asserting limits actually did threaten connection. When a child depended on caregivers who were emotionally fragile, overwhelmed, or unpredictable, saying no or expressing needs could lead to withdrawal, anger, or abandonment. The nervous system learned a simple equation: boundaries equal danger. So the child adapts by becoming accommodating. They learn to override discomfort, suppress impulses, and stay available even when depleted. Love becomes something that must be protected through compliance. This pattern is reinforced when the child is praised for being easygoing, understanding, or mature. The message is clear: belonging requires self-denial. Over time, the capacity to sense personal limits weakens, replaced by an instinct to prioritize others at any cost. In adulthood, this conditioning resurfaces whenever boundaries are needed. The moment one considers saying no, the body reacts with guilt, anxiety, or fear. The mind may know that a boundary is reasonable, yet the body responds as if a vital bond is about to be severed. This is why boundary setting often feels cruel or selfish, even when it is necessary for well-being. The emotional response is disproportionate to the situation because it is rooted in the past. What is being felt is not the present relationship, but the echo of an earlier one where survival depended on compliance. The nervous system does not distinguish time, it only remembers threat. Healing involves recognizing this confusion and gently separating past from present. Boundaries are not punishments. They are not rejections. They are expressions of self, respect, and clarity. When the body begins to experience that connection can survive honesty and limits, boundaries no longer feel like betrayal, but like truth taking shape in relationship. Burnout is often misunderstood as a failure of resilience, a sign that a person was not strong enough or disciplined enough to keep going. In reality, burnout is not a weakness of character, but an intelligence of the body. It is the moment when the system refuses to continue a pattern that has long violated its limits. Long before exhaustion becomes visible, the body has been signaling distress through tension, anxiety, irritability, and quiet despair. For many people, burnout follows years of chronic overextension. They have learned to ignore hunger, rest, emotional needs, and inner signals in order to remain functional, reliable, and acceptable. This is especially common in those who were conditioned early to prioritize others' needs over their own. Productivity became a measure of worth, and rest felt unsafe or undeserved. The body adapted by pushing past fatigue again and again, until pushing was no longer possible. Burnout is not sudden. It is cumulative. It builds when giving is constant and receiving is scarce, when effort is demanded without replenishment, when authenticity is repeatedly sacrificed for approval or stability. The nervous system remains in a prolonged state of activation, unable to complete stress cycles. Over time, this leads to emotional numbness, a physical illness, cognitive fog, and a loss of meaning. The body begins to shut down functions not essential for survival, conserving energy by force rather than choice. In this way, burnout is not the enemy. It is the body drawing a boundary where the mind could not. It is a protest against exploitation, both external and internal, a refusal to continue living in contradiction to one's own needs. Healing does not come from pushing harder or managing symptoms alone. It comes from listening to what the exhaustion is asking for. Slowness, honesty, safety, a restructuring of life that no longer requires self-erasure for survival. For those who learned early that love was conditional, the idea of being selfish carries deep emotional weight. It is associated with danger, rejection, and shame. Being selfish once meant risking connection, so the self was set aside in favor of pleasing, adapting, and staying acceptable. Healing, in this context, is not about becoming inconsiderate or detached. It is about reclaiming what was once forbidden: the right to have needs, preferences, limits, and desires. What is often labeled as selfish is simply self-attunement. It is listening to hunger before collapse, rest before illness, truth before resentment. But for someone conditioned to prioritize others, tuning inward can feel profoundly wrong. The body may respond with guilt, anxiety, or fear, as if an unspoken rule has been broken. These reactions are not moral signals. They are remnants of an old survival strategy that equated self-denial with safety. Healing begins when this conditioning is gently questioned. When one starts to notice that caring for oneself does not automatically harm others, that relationships capable of sustaining honesty are not destroyed by boundaries. That authenticity, rather than compliance, is what allows real intimacy to exist. Choosing oneself does not mean abandoning compassion. It means extending compassion inward for the first time. Being selfish in this sense is not about taking at the expense of others. It is about no longer taking from oneself. It is the shift from living in reaction to living in alignment, from earning worth through sacrifice to recognizing worth as inherent. This kind of selfishness restores balance. It allows giving to emerge from fullness rather than depletion. As self-trust develops, the nervous system begins to relax. Decisions no longer feel like betrayals. Rest no longer feels dangerous. Desire no longer feels like a threat to belonging. Healing unfolds not as a dramatic transformation, but as a quiet permission to exist without apology, to choose what nourishes the self, and to discover that love rooted in authenticity is far more sustainable than love built on self-erasure. The empath's journey is not about learning how to feel others more deeply. It is about learning how to feel themselves without shame. It is about allowing the child who was never permitted to be selfish to finally choose authenticity over adaptation, presence over performance, and self-compassion over survival.